The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclecs Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, Southbound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org.
Welcome. Happy Monday, everyone. Hope you're doing well. I am so glad you are here. You, just in case, double checking where you are. I don't know if you've ever had that nightmare where you showed up in the wrong classroom in school. I'm going to alleviate that right now and tell you, if you are in the session for the ultimate guide to podcast branding, you're in the right place. So if that is not where you're supposed to be, stay anyway. You're going to learn some things. And if that's where you're supposed to be, good job. You got to the right place. My name is Tiffany Bryant Jackson. I am your moderator for today. I've got a few housekeeping notes before I turn things over to our wonderful presenter. But I have to remind you guys of a few things. So first and foremost, this is recorded. It is recorded for you and anyone who may have missed the session today. If you miss something or you have to step away, you will always be able to come back and gather this information. So this is a recorded podcast. I also tell you that so you can warn people in your household, this is not the time to walk around without a shirt on today. So please note, we are recorded. To date, we have had over 12,000 plus registrants for our first annual podcast festival. So I don't know about you, but I'm going to do a dance real quick. This podcast festival is brought to you by WFAE, Queen City Podcast Network, Blumenthal Performing Arts, and Eclecs Creative Agency. They have come together to bring you something fantastic. 4 straight weeks of podcast education, from genre to branding to the technology. All of it is here for you. If you have not attended other classes, please log into some other sessions. You still have a chance to register throughout the last 2 weeks to pick up some information. I have attended a few, and I'm telling you, you don't want to miss it. I've learned some things that I hadn't even thought about in the world of podcasting. So take some time after this session. If you only sign up for a couple, go back and review that document and get on to some other ones, or as I like to say, get into it, because it'll be great. A few other housekeeping things. We are going to do some questions. We're going to save most of our Q&As for the end of the session. Now, if you have some questions you want me to look at before we get to there, please put it in the chat. I'll be keeping note. We'll keep up with them. So when we get to the end, we'll make room for you guys to ask all the questions you want. If you get them in the chat, I'll make sure we get it to our wonderful presenter today. So don't be afraid to use the chat. Even if it's not a question, if you're like, if Lisa says something and you're like, yes, you can put that in the chat. I'm okay with that. Everyone needs a little hyping up when they're speaking. So add that in. It doesn't hurt anybody. All right. So again, you are here today for the ultimate guide to podcast branding. Your speaker is going to be Lisa Speer. She's got some wonderful things to share with you. So whether you are reaching a big audience, starting out as a hobby, whatever it is, your podcast is a brand, and she's going to show you how to get your podcast to stand out. This is a big overview because she has another session tomorrow. So take note of what she's telling you, but also tune in if you want to take a deeper dive into this. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Lisa, and she's going to take you on a journey, guys.
Thanks so much. Well, let me go ahead and get my screen share going. Make sure we all got that. Okay, great. So likely passion is what brought you here. I know it's definitely what brought me here. And like we were talking about, it actually can be because you have a passion that you're trying to share through your podcast. It's a hobby. It could be that you're using it as a tool to market your business. You're using your podcast as a way to educate or entertain. But no matter what your intent and how much thought you've put into it, you actually do have a brand with your podcast. So we're going to get into some stuff today. But like I said, I this was my passion. This was like how I came to it. Like I have a strategic branding business, but I created my podcast, Branding BFF, because I thought there was a real need to fill some gaps before people actually started working with me. So likely you guys have some reasons that you're building your podcast or you've already built it. But the things we're going to start by covering is first, what is brand strategy? Then we're going to talk about the brand elements of your podcast. And spoiler alert, it's bigger than your logo or your podcast graphics. Why is branding important? 3 key questions to help you define your brand, and 3 tips to help you gain brand loyalty. So we're going to start with what's brand strategy. So I relate it as making intentional decisions about all the parts of your brand before, after, and during the time you're connecting with your audience. Most people just think about the during, but it's really that whole cycle. So let's start with the visual elements, because I think that's the thing that most people think of when they think of a brand. They think of a logo or they think of their podcast graphics, and those are a big part of your brand. It's the things that people see first. But it's also, how you're using the visuals in your social media. It's the colors, the fonts, the photos you're using. So if you remember to my first slide, that brand is the Charlotte Podcast Festival brand. And here we're using my colors from my brand. So you'll see different colors throughout that are part of my branding. But Charlotte Podcast colors, are that bright yellow and that bright green. So we think about even the colors you're using are part of your brand. The typefaces you use, you're going to see different ones repeated throughout here. And like I mentioned, the photos, like are your photos like a really high contrast, really bright saturation? Or in some people's case for their podcast, they're going to use illustration. They're not going to use a photo. And there's a mix of styles. But all these visual elements are a big part of your brand. Then the next part of your brand is the verbal elements. And this is where you're deciding your podcast name. It's the description of your podcast. So like when you're putting it up in iTunes, like that short description, that paragraph that you're using. It's the language style. Is the style that you're using to communicate in your podcast educational, informative, entertaining, inspiring, irreverent? Like this is actually helping to shape your brand, the tone that you're using in your podcast. And then of course, things like your hashtags can help support it. Like, we have Charlotte Podcast Festival, so CLT Podfest. That's one of the tools that we have with the Podcast Festival brand. But these are all the elements that maybe aren't the first things that come to mind, but you think about, are you working with guests, or are you running the podcast strictly by yourself? You're the only one speaking. So there's different dynamics that happen in the verbal tone if you have guests versus if it's just you. So this is another area of your brand. Next, we have the experiential elements. This can be things like how frequent and how consistent is your podcast. So your audience kind of builds up an expectation. I can tell you guys, once coronavirus hit, my consistency went out the window. I was scrambling like, okay, what do I do? Where do I record my podcast? The studio that I was using, I didn't feel like I could actually go in there anymore. And for a while, I really couldn't. So my consistency has gone out the window. But before COVID, I was very consistent. The first and third Tuesday of every month, you start to build that expectation. That's part of the experience of your brand. Your show notes, like actually, if you have show notes, that can help support people's experience. They can refer back more easily. And these are things you might not think about as part of your brand, but people do have an experience with your brand. Some people give access to special content to their loyal listeners, or maybe they do something with Patreon. So these are all things that if you're giving people sort of this behind the scenes experience that they aren't getting another way, that can help set you apart as well. So when we think about it, all 3 of these areas work together. And that goes back to this point, your brand is bigger than your logo. That was one of the spoiler alerts we had in the description, because your brand is actually this immersive experience. The verbal, the visual, the experiential, it's immersive. So imagine, these are some of the podcasts that are in my feed right now. When I think about each of these, why they're in my feed is because they give me a particular immersive experience, everything from the visual, the verbal, the experiential. So you might ask the question, so why is branding important? And there's a couple top ones for me. The first is that brand recognition, to have a memorable presence. If you go, let's go back one slide. Let's go 2 slides. You can imagine, like, on a really small screen, you still want your podcast graphic to stand out. And we're going to go a deep dive into that tomorrow at another session. But you do want your graphics to stand out, because you can imagine you're seeing these really small. At a quick glance, you want to have a memorable presence. You want people to be able to find that podcast that maybe they listened to once, maybe they haven't actually subscribed yet, or maybe they're searching for something on a topic that they're very passionate about, and your podcast fills that need. So we want to have a memorable presence. It also can differentiate yourself in the marketplace. So let's just say, there's 3 podcasts on branding. Well, you want to be able to differentiate yourself from others. So for me, having the term branding BFF, in America, BFF means best friend forever. So I'm taking that play on being your branding best friend. So that's going to help me stand out from maybe some of the other podcasts that are on branding that maybe are more educational only, and they're not as candid conversational. You also want to be taken seriously. When you have a strong brand, it allows people to take you in a very professional realm, even if your content is very lighthearted or playful. When they know that you're taking your brand seriously, it's a greater opportunity for sponsorships. So going back to the experiential piece, you've probably heard a lot of people in some of the first sessions talking about sound quality. That's another way that people can take you seriously. If you got good sound and you can make sure people can hear you, it's going to stand out. But the other thing with branding your podcast, a lot of people have their intro and outro music. Well, that's a sound signature. That's also part of your brand. So, actually taking a little time to think about what kind of experience do you want people to have? Are you going to start out your podcast where you're like high energy? Is it very soothing and calm? What's the vibe that you're really going for with that quick intro into your podcast? So while that sounds like it's just a sound situation that you might have talked about in that first week, it actually really is a part of your brand as well. And then branding also helps people self-identify. This podcast is for me. I like what that looks like. I like what that sounds like. I like the way this makes me feel or what I learned from this. And it can also really help you build connection with your audience. It's that know, like, and trust factor. So I have created 3 questions for you to ask yourself that can really help you define your brand in this bigger sense, right? Like, we're not going into the nitty-gritty of the graphics today, that's tomorrow. But what we're looking at as that brand, as the immersive experience, as this bigger picture umbrella to help you set the stage and the tone for what's to come. Or if you've already got your podcast, what you can do is be thinking about, okay, what are the missing pieces? Because just because you've got something out there, a lot of times people start and they're just like eager to get in, right? So maybe you hadn't put as much thought into how it looks or the name of it or the actual experience people are having beyond your main content. So you can think about this if you've already got something. How might I strengthen my podcast through asking myself these questions? So our first one is, what's your vision? It sounds simple, but you want to think about the goal of your podcast. Is it to educate? Is it to entertain? Is it to inspire? And that can work whether or not you're using it as a tool to help raise awareness or visibility for your business, whether it's a hobby, whether it's a passion project, whether you're, really just trying to shine the light on a topic that maybe you don't feel like people are addressing fully. So thinking about the goal of your podcast beyond just what it is for you, what is it for the audience that you're trying to accomplish? And then think about how will your name, your content, and how you structure your podcast help you do that. So for example, if we think about the name's got to be real quick, right? Like I always think about being clear over clever, but if you can be clever too, and that's part of your brand tone, then that's great. But how is that name going to help support it? How is the structure of your podcast? Is it interview style? Is it conversational? Is it you're the main person dispensing like the education or the inspiration? So all these things are good questions to ask yourself. And let's look at an example. So how I built this with Guy Raz. NPR, is like the host family for it. But, we think about when I look at it, I'm guessing that this is a goal to inspire and to educate. And how they do it is they do interviews with famous business owners who go from their humble beginnings to their challenges to actually their success. So these are people who, when you hear the stories and you hear how they started out, you're actually shocked that how hard it was for them in the beginning and where they ended up. Like with these massive big companies, that's really inspiring because you think like, I just thought this was a really big company and they just kind of had it made from the beginning, or they came from money, or they came from this. But you actually get to see through their telling of the story that it's not just like that, a shiny object at the end, like I succeeded and I sold my company for this millions and billions of dollars. And one of the things that they also use as a way to help cement this is they ask how much luck and how much was hard work. So each person at the very end, they got to determine like, how much do I think of my success was based on hard work and how much of it was luck? And you're going to hear different answers. But what I believe that does, again, is it really helps to inspire and educate people who are having a small business and have these lofty goals, but they're not there yet. So let's look at the question number 2. Who is your audience? And sometimes it's hard to know in the beginning, but we do want to think about our best guess based on our goal, our vision. So along the line, you may discover it becomes bigger or different than you think, but you want to start with like, who am I actually talking to? Who am I creating this for? The more specific you are, the better. A lot of times we think, oh, this could apply to everybody, or everybody could enjoy this. And that may be true, but it's very hard to connect with an audience if they feel like you're talking to everybody and you're not talking to what their cares are, what they're interested in. And sometimes it means being really specific. So the more you're trying to talk to everybody, it's harder to connect, but you'll also sound more generic and likely be more forgettable. So I'm going to give you another example from my podcast feed. So this is The Wire Way Down in the Hole. So this is a very good example of a very targeted podcast. It's for the super fans of HBO's The Wire TV show. And there are some new fans just discovering it. And their goal is to entertain and educate. They really go deeper. They even weave in things from the book that talks about with interviews from people in the show and the creators. And the way they go about it is they have conversation between 2 co-hosts, 1 podcast episode per TV episode. So for anyone who hasn't seen this show had 5 seasons. And I think it was about a total of 60 hours total. So you can imagine this podcast, for someone to actually listen to 60 hours, because they basically did an hour per episode, is going to be for a super fan or someone who's on their way to being a super fan like me. So you think about a very targeted niche audience. This is one of them. I mean, I don't know how many watchers of The Wire there are out in the world, but I do know it's still a smaller segment than what a lot of the podcasts are geared toward. So don't be afraid to think about your audience and being really specific. So the next question is, What's your vibe and your style? And this is one that I think that sometimes starting out too, you may not have quite figured it out. But if you've been podcasting for a while, you probably have a rhythm going. You probably have a feeling like I could actually describe my vibe and style to somebody. So again, as you're starting out, you got to think about, what do I want it to be? Like, I actually get to decide. I get to craft it. You know, with our own human personalities, sometimes we think like, I was just born this way. But with our podcast, it actually does have a personality. We do get to decide how we shape it. We do decide what our brand stands for and how we go about presenting ourselves. So think about, what's the vibe, kind of like a brand personality. And then you also want to make sure that all the visual, the verbal, and the experiential elements that go into creating it line up. So let's think about it a little bit like, it's an immersive experience, it's holistic, and your brand personality is that thing that kind of sets you apart from another podcast. You might be talking about the exact same topic, but you're two different people, or you're two different approaches. Let's say there's 10 people on the same topic that you're talking about. You actually want to think about, if you already know there's people operating in that same space you are, how do you want to differentiate yourself? What about your personality of your podcast is going to be a little different? And not in a fake way, but just being aware of other people in your space will actually help you. Knowing who your quote competitors are will help you look at, well, how will I set myself apart? What about my personality? What about my vibe? What about my style is going to be different? And then you make sure that you think about the visual, the verbal, and the experiential along with it. So I'm going to give you another hopefully well-known example, at least for people in the US, Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard. Now, Dax Shepard is someone who's gone through recovery. He is very open about his journey. He's very open about his feelings as a human and his process around, actually being a better human, really. And so the audience, how I see it for his podcast, is people that are interested in real, in-depth conversations with smart, interesting humans. But when I say in-depth, I mean, these episodes are like sometimes an hour and a half, 2 hours long. So this is not your like quick get in, get out. This is like really going deep into conversations about humanity. And I think he hits all three areas: the entertain, the educate, and the inspire. So he goes deep into these really honest and vulnerable conversations about the messiness of being human. Like he gets out there and talks about his failings. And what it does is, when he's interviewing different guests, it allows them to be more open. It allows them to be more open. It allows them to be more honest, more vulnerable. And so when he's interviewing different celebrities, different journalists, different academics, he actually sets the stage for them to be able to have these more intimate, vulnerable conversations, because he starts with him first. So that's a vibe that I think, a lot of people are starting to really appreciate, and they're realizing what this kind of podcast brings to the table. I think Brene Brown is another one. But I think Dax Shepard is a great example, because essentially recently he also kind of had a lapse in his sobriety through some pain medication. And, I saw the podcast episode title that day, and it was called Day 7. And because I've been a fan of this podcast, I've been listening to it for so long, I had a feeling that Day 7 meant that he was on Day 7 of a new recovery, like that he'd already lapsed. And so my heart immediately leapt out to him. And I thought, wow, the courage it takes to be Day 7 of being sober again and be communicating with your audience in such a real way. That to me is setting the vibe and a personality that is rooted in authenticity. It's rooted in courage. It's rooted in really wanting to be transparent and have a deep connection, not just with the people that you're interviewing, but being honest with your audience. So let's put it all together into a real person not these famous podcasts, not these, maybe you think like, okay, they've got all this money. I'm going to bring it back to me because I started out, I think it was just about a year and a half ago. Didn't know how to do anything in terms of podcasts. And I had to figure out, like, how am I going to approach creating a podcast? Because I've got a branding business, but I had to figure out, like, what's going to be, I had to take myself through all these same questions and these same exercises. So what I decided was that I wanted to both educate and inspire. And I created a very narrow audience. I said, you know what? I work with a lot of service businesses, so I feel like those are my people. The service businesses, the people who are creative professionals, like the writers, the photographers, people who are consultants, and people who are coaches, whether it's a life coach or a business coach. So I feel like, those are the people I know. And I've actually had my training in all these different areas as well. So these are my people. So I could have said it's going to be for everybody because these topics are relevant for everybody, but I chose to narrow my focus. And then how did I do it? I decided to focus on one branding topic per podcast episode. I'm not trying to do a history of how to brand in one podcast episode. There's just no way. There's also no way we could do the whole thing today in 1 hour. But what I did is I decided I prefer interaction. In fact, like today, it's tough because like I can't see you guys right now because I've got the screen share on. We're not able to have the same kind of interaction we'd be having if this was in person. So, but I know that for my podcast, I didn't want to just be talking where I can't even get a sense. Like, we're going to have questions at the end. In a podcast episode, I don't even get that. I don't know how it landed. So what I wanted to do was actually talk to different entrepreneurs. I wanted to talk to them about their brand and their business around one particular topic so that it can hopefully inspire and educate people so they can apply stuff to their own brand and business. So things like brand communication during a crisis. That was one that I did in March. I do things like considerations like the road to a rebrand, or how do you align your brand on social media? So I brought in somebody who's an expert in social media. So all these are like different wedges of the conversation. And then the vibe I'm going for my podcast is I want it to be casual. I want it to be like really sound like two best friends talking, but it's about their brand and business as opposed to just best friend talk. It's informative, and I'm super passionate because I want to take the mystery out of branding. I want to empower everybody around their brand. So this is how I went through those questions for myself. And then it's a matter of, as you go, being like, okay, am I still on track? Or are there places that I can continue to improve it? If I'm having guests on, what's their experience as well? How is that helping communicate the brand? How is it aligned with my business? And in fact, tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about how you either align your passion project with your brand or your business with your podcast brand. So there are these connection points that you want to think about. How is it different? How is it similar? In my business, it's a very collaborative approach. So I wanted my podcast to feel like that. If you've got a hobby and you're just super passionate about it, do you enjoy talking about this topic with friends? And do you want to capture that? There's a woman I know here in Charlotte, and she has a podcast that's all about Beyonce. She and her best friend, all they do is talk about Beyonce. So, it's fun for her to do that with somebody. Or, imagine, let's just say there's somebody else who loves Beyonce. Like, are they really excited to just talk about it and share all the things that they know, and they're sharing it to you, the audience? So these are all different ways that you can, help set your vibe. So now let's get a little bit into how do I create podcast loyalty? Well, I should say brand loyalty through my podcast. And I think I'm going to take each one, and I want to spend a little minute on each, because the first one is you want to have a clear brand. And I think as we've been talking about, you can see there's a lot of pieces to your brand. And being clear actually starts with yourself. Like, you can't expect somebody else to be clear about your brand and what you stand for if you're not clear yourself. So I always think about it as that ring that I've been showing you guys, but also like the strategy, the thoughts, the intention that you're bringing to the table, that needs to come at the center of it all. That's sort of that foundation that hooks it all together. But the more clear you are about being specific about who you are and what you provide, it'll make it a lot easier to shorten that connection between you and your audience. When they can quickly get a sense like, hey, this is for me, they read the description of their podcast, they see your podcast graphic, they listen to an episode, or they listen to your little intro before you've actually started launching your podcast episodes. And those can be things that can be really underlooked too, like that really first quick intro about what your podcast is going to be about. You really want to think about how you can capture that flavor very quickly. Let's say it's going to be interviews, but you don't have, you're not doing the little quick intro overview as an interview. Well, then you still want to capture what that flavor is going to be like. You want to paint the picture of what's to come, because you capture people at 1 or 2 little episodes and they're going to decide pretty quickly, do they want to continue listening? Is this a brand that they want to participate in, a podcast they want to participate with? Or is it something that they're ready to turn it off and they're not going to subscribe? So that leads to being a clear brand. But the second part is compelling content. And I have no doubt that you guys are creating compelling content. But the point here is just to think about, how do you make it engaging so that people want more from that very first little bit, or your music intro, or again, the graphic. You want to make sure that you keep building things that help people want to see more. And even things like your hashtags, these are tools that can help communicate your brand. If your brand is very functional and very literal, your hashtags might be very simple and straightforward. If your brand is really irreverent or really playful, then your hashtags, you want them to carry that tone. If it's very inspiring, then you probably want some of your hashtags to communicate that as well. And then of course there is trying to make sure that your podcast name is distinct. Nobody else has anything like it. And then you can also have a hashtag that is aligned. So, hashtag is a very small piece of the puzzle here, guys. I'm not saying a hashtag is the end all be all, but if your brand has that fun or playful or, surprising element, you can actually use your podcast hashtags to captivate somebody, to pull them in a little more. And then I think the third one, clear brand, compelling content, consistent experience. I can tell you guys right now, I have some really great examples of how my podcast has not had a consistent experience during COVID. I went to doing a couple remote episodes and the sound quality was not the same. I did the best I could in post to try to get it, to the quality I'm used to. But I'm still trying to figure out the best tool right now, and I have not been as consistent. But what I can say is that the quality of my content or the kinds of people I'm having on, that's still good. It's been a little bit of uneven. And you'll hear everybody say it's great to be consistent because that helps people know what to expect. I 100% agree. You want to give people what you promise. So sometimes it might mean changing the expectations, right? So right now, I don't say I put out a podcast every first and third Tuesday while I'm trying to get this new rhythm. But I will say that at least, as much as you can, you want to build that history, that relationship that's reliable for people. So thinking about it too, from the brand standpoint, having consistent tone or consistent quality, those are all things that will help really support the brand. So I think that the biggest thing here that you'll probably get from this is that you want to think about your brand as this holistic experience for people. It's immersive. There's a lot of pieces to it. And it's not to overwhelm you. It's the opportunity is to like connect the dots, that you can use these things to weave together this this brand and this experience for people that can be very intentional, it can be very compelling, and it can be a great tool to help you better and more quickly connect with your audience. So here's my contact information if you guys just want to stay in touch in terms of my podcast or anything. And then I want to let you guys know that we have a whole episode tomorrow that's going to go a really deep dive into how to create your podcast graphics, and also how you can be thinking about connecting your podcast with either a passion project or with your business, and using the graphics as a way to help build that out as well. I purposely went through this content a little fast today. You probably noticed me speaking a little fast because I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of questions. And I want to make sure that we have time to dig into all the questions you guys have, because while this is an ultimate guide to branding as a whole, there's probably a lot of specific things you might be wondering about when you're thinking about all these different facets of your brand. So I want to check in and see how many questions we've got, and we can really start digging in.
We've got a few.
Okay.
So we've got a few, but I'm going to ask you to go back 2 slides. Someone would love to see your contact information again.
Oh, sure.
Let's keep that up for a little bit for everyone.
Sure.
So, questions I'm going to go ahead and ask. I'm going to let you guys know tuned in. If I skip your question, it is not on purpose. We are going to be mindful of time, but also remember that she is taking a deep dive in tomorrow as well. So if we miss something, it may be because it's also coming. So we will ask away. So first, I'm going to ask, and they're not in order. Don't yell at me in the comments, guys. They're not going to be in order. I was taking notes this whole time. But I do love this last one that came up. What is your advice for branding when it comes to personal versus podcast? Are they 2 separate things, or are you the brand?
I think it depends on how you want to approach it. Anything that you're putting out there can be a brand. You know, like you could actually, if you're using your name, that can be, you're intentionally choosing to brand yourself. There's plenty of people that do that. However, if you, by the very nature of you having a podcast, that is putting you out there, particularly if you're the one speaking. So I would start with thinking about, you know, what is your goal for the podcast? Is it in some way tying to you? Like, are you wanting to be a public speaker? Are you trying to build a name for yourself? Or are you trying to build a name for the podcast? For me, my name is different than my business name for my podcast. I was really just looking at how do I build a bigger audience to share about my taking the mystery out of branding, right? Like I wanted to build a bigger audience for that so more people can understand whether or not they ever work with me or not. So if you can share very quickly maybe what your goal is here, I could perhaps direct the answer a little more specifically to you. Do we have time for that?
We've got just a moment. I've got a few questions to get to, but
okay. I think the point is your podcast, even if it's a passion project, does not have to tie to you. You can always put in your graphic your name smaller, but unless you're famous, most people don't build a podcast around their name unless they're already famous or they have something particular that they're trying to be the platform for. I think you could easily have a podcast name that connects for what you're trying to accomplish with your podcast and to connect with your audience. Most people don't know me personally that are listening to my podcast, if that makes sense.
That is actually perfect sense.
Okay.
Someone wants to know, what tips do you have for making the content more engaging? Do you have strategies or tips?
Well, I think a big thing for me is like, what is the tone you're going for? You know, I mean, I'll tell you, I listen to a podcast at night to go to sleep. It's called The History of Rome. So for me, like, I'm actually learning something, but I'm also using it as a way to wind down. I think if the engaging goes back to what am I trying to accomplish? Who is my audience? And I would think about using as many elements as you can to engage people. So if you think about, because it's all audio, are you painting a visual picture? Or are you using video with your podcast because it's adding a whole nother element that you couldn't get any other way? And it's not just video of you talking, right? It would have to bring something else to the table. Is it the environment you're in is very interesting. So I think about the content itself is the content best communicated by you talking, or is it about talking to other people? Is it about different vantage points? I think sometimes if you are trying to engage, having more than one voice can make a big difference, but it's also how you're choosing to approach it. I know that if you're just talking to somebody, you have to make sure that then your voice has dynamics, like that you're actually not just speaking monotone. Otherwise, someone may start tuning out. So I would think about, projecting energy. I would think about making sure that the things that you're describing are going to be interesting to them. So that's partly going back to knowing who your audience is, or at least defining who you want your audience to be and speaking to that. Does that help?
I think it's helpful. You guys let us know in the chat. Someone wanted to know, they started out with one logo and they kind of branded another way, and then they got on their journey, but they kind of want to make changes. Is that a risky move for them to make change? Name is the same, but the look will be a little different. Is that a risky move?
If people are already subscribed to your podcast, they're still going to, get the information. You may want to support that with some social posts to let people know that there's a change. You may want to show like a before and after. How on Instagram you can show, 2 images. So you may want to show the before and after. You could do that with Facebook or Twitter. So I think that just as much communication as you can through the channels you already have. But yeah, you can easily make that change without too much trouble. Will people, if they're searching for it, usually if they're already subscribed, they're just going to see a change. So people searching for it for the first time, it's probably not going to be an issue. It's being intentional, sure, like thinking about it. I think that's good to consider it, but I don't think that that's a huge risk when subscription is usually the way people are going to be fed your podcast.
That is smart to think about. I often think about that in personal branding. If I change it, will people know it's me?
Yeah, and I do think as much as you can communicate around it, all the places you have opportunity to, yes.
Awesome. Now you mentioned here when they are making the change, they're going to be sharing it on other platforms, not just their podcast, on Twitter or Facebook. So someone wanted to know, what platforms do you suggest in pumping out your content other than the actual podcast?
There are people that are going to be talking a lot about marketing this week as well. So I'm definitely not an expert at marketing. What I will say is, pick your channels and try to stick with them. So for me, I was just Facebook and Instagram. But what I realized is a lot of my people actually are on LinkedIn. So I have started sharing my content on LinkedIn as well. I think that, knowing where your people are is really good. Like I do stuff on Twitter just to let people know about the episodes, but I'm never on Twitter. So that's not, it's in a way, it's kind of like I do it to kind of stay loosely connected, but I just feel like me and my people probably aren't spending as much time on Twitter. So I think, where are the places that you'll be sustainable, I think is part of it too. Like if you enjoy being on Twitter, awesome, be on Twitter. But if you don't, I wouldn't kill yourself to be on a platform that you don't enjoy.
Right. And I think that goes past branding. That is just whatever you're building, whether it's a podcast or not. I think about my generation and everyone kind of flooding to TikTok because Gary Vee said it was the next big thing.
Yeah.
I need to be on TikTok and nobody needs to see me on TikTok. I also don't have the mental energy to figure out TikTok right now. And so what Lisa is saying is get where you're comfortable and work with that, which is just outside of podcasting, a smart move, whatever you're building.
You'll be more consistent too. Like you'll be more consistent where you're comfortable. And it doesn't mean don't stretch yourself ever, but if that's the thing that helps you be consistent, then do that.
All right. Someone wants to know, at what point in the process do you have a solidified plan to ensure you can promise brand consistency? Does it take a lot of time, a lot of interviews before you're certain of your trajectory? And then what vision of you will consistency offer in your podcast?
Okay, I'm going to answer the first one, then I want to come back to the second one because I'm already in my head's in the first one. So for me, what I did is I created a little one-sheeter before I even started my podcast, and I kind of mapped out like what's the tone I'm going for, who are the kind of guests, what are the kind of topics I want to do, just to make sure like, okay, this is something that's got some legs. It's not like I'll do 5 episodes and then I'll be like, okay, I've said everything there is to say, or I've talked to everybody I would want to talk to. If you are starting your podcast, I would recommend, doing like a one sheet just in Word or whatever program you use, and just kind of map out the vision you have for it and think about what are the things that you already know and what are the things maybe that are the unknowns for you. It's okay not to have all the answers at the beginning. Like, I think everything that we do as a brand or a business or a passion project or a hobby is going to evolve. So it's not about you have to get it right from the beginning, but it is trying to be as intentional as you can from the beginning. If you've already created your podcast, I would go back and think through what are the connecting factors, like if the podcast episodes that you've really enjoyed or you think that really connected with people, what's in common with those? What's sort of the tone that you've been able to build so far, looking back and starting to analyze it, what are the best kind of guests that you've had if you have guests? And I would just go back and almost like do a little audit of your podcast and think like, what really worked? What do I want to do more of? And maybe what are the things that didn't work as well? Either need to improve them, or what do I want to do less of? And so that way it will help you build consistency because you're being aware and intentional. And then visually, again, things can change. It's just once you've made a change, then try to be consistent with that next phase. I've known people to, change some of their social graphics. That's fine. It's just then for that next leg of the journey, try to be as consistent as you can be, if that makes sense.
It does. Speaking of consistency, do you think right now, I know, I mean, it's a great word. Let's be real. We all need some consistency in our life. I tell a lot of people, I work with a lot of children, and I say what kids are looking for is consistency. They're not looking for Mary Poppins. It's consistent. Yeah. So I love it too. Do you think people are more understanding right now with where we are in the world with, not being able to get out, not being able to record in a studio, with where you are and maybe not as consistent? And it may not be time consistent. It may be sound, like you mentioned earlier. Do you think people are accepting that right now?
I think they are, particularly for smaller podcasts. I think if you're talking about some of the big name ones that I was using as examples, I think they do have a little higher expectation, because often those places either have their own podcast studio or they're paying people to help make sure that the quality is really good. I know I do everything myself, so I really do hope people are, more forgiving during this time. And I have to believe that they are, because we still want to connect. We still want great content. We still are looking for different things to take our mind off of things that are happening in the world, or we're using the podcast as a way to dig deeper into the topics of the stuff that's happening in our world. And I would just say that I haven't seen any drop in my numbers, and I've been putting less podcast episodes out, and people are just going back and listening to old ones. So I feel like, I'm not so far along in my podcast journey that I feel like I have the street cred that a lot of people do with their podcasts. And I've actually not seen my numbers really drop. I've seen people going back further and re-listening to old stuff. So by my small sample size, I think people are, more patient or understanding. And my guess is, all you can do is the best you can do right now. We all have a lot of competing challenges that everyone's facing. And so I, at one point, was going to make myself crazy trying to make it as consistent. And I just realized, like, that's not the reality that I'm in right now. So that's where I'm at. And I believe other people are as well.
I'm going to say bravo for recognizing that. I've watched people push hard to get to an ideal, and we are in a pandemic and it's 2020. It's okay.
Yep. And we've never been
there right there. Right. And I think, to your point though, of people going back, I think a lot of people are utilizing podcasts to get through a lot of things.
Yes.
I myself have gone back. I re-listened to, I'm a true crime podcast junkie, and I realized I had gone back in episodes I'd already heard. And part of me was like, you heard this already. And the other part was like, I need this. I need it right now. So I think the audience is going to be there if you've built the audience. Yes. I don't think they're running away. Normally I'm going to answer that question for them. They want to know if you can access recordings of a podcast. Are you asking for the festival or for, there you go. She's already on it. Yes. Okay. Is she asking for a specific podcast or for the festival?
And there was a question before that was 2 parts, and I was focused on the first part and I didn't get to answer the second part
of it was, sorry, I have so much in front of me. Give me 1 second, I'll get back to it.
No problem.
Some stuff. While I'm going back to that second part though, this was one you can answer.
Okay.
That will go with branding, but kind of in format. How do you divide your seasons? Do you just go every year or by topic, or is it one straight through?
Mine's been straight through with breaks. So I took December off last year, again, thinking like I was going to try to make it all work, but getting guests during December, I didn't plan that out well enough. So I took a break, and it's been pretty consistent again until COVID hit. And then it's been I've only done a few episodes since COVID hit. And a lot of things, happening in the world, I just was like, feel like attention needs to be on other places right now. However, I think that, what I could look at now is like, do I need to move into seasons, right? Because if I'm feeling like I'm having trouble, I think it's just like recalibrating, right? So is it going to be seasons, or do I just change my frequency and say once a month, which is not ideal, but maybe that's what I need to move to be able to deliver consistency.
That makes sense. I've got the second part of the question.
Okay.
And so same thing. Does it sometimes take a lot of interviews before you're certain of your podcast trajectory and have a vision of what will be consistent for your podcast?
I think it can. I actually took a little podcast class maybe about a year before I started, because I knew it was going to be a big commitment. So I had a lot more time to think it through, but I have heard that in that class, they were talking about how, sometimes it can be like 10 episodes before you really figure it out, because if you've never done anything like this before, you're trying to find your voice, you're trying to figure out the trajectory, you're trying to figure out what works and doesn't work. And I really believe in not putting that pressure on yourself to try to get it perfect or get it right out the gate. You can also record 10 podcast episodes and then choose like, I don't want to release them yet. Maybe I need to do the 10 to figure it out, and then I do more, and that's when I get my stride, and that's when I start releasing them. So I think you can just give yourself permission to experiment and to figure it out, and then choose what gets released is maybe a great approach. Probably what I would do if I didn't have my tone kind of figured out from the beginning. I just happened to have a lot more time to think about it, because I really was like, am I going to do this? Because it is a commitment. And so I took some time.
Right. I love it. I've been working on a podcast project, and we have been recording. We're not ready to release, but I will take us a few recordings to go, oh, this is our dynamic and this is where we're going. So I did that suggestion of taking some time to figure it out. All right. Last question.
Can I add one point to that? So Dax Shepard recently, he was saying for his podcast, Armchair Expert, he's like, I thought I knew what it was, but it wasn't until later other people told us what it was, like that they saw something bigger than what he saw at the beginning. And it's really interesting too. Like sometimes your audience or your trusted friends or, other podcast listeners that you trust can actually reflect things that maybe you're not seeing. So he still released them all. In fact, his first episode was with his wife and they were arguing and he was like, should I release this or not? But they decided to. And it was a big power dynamic that first episode. But because he released it, it allowed people to realize, no, he's really going to share the real stuff with us. So I think there is value in also releasing something that isn't perfect because it can allow people to connect because it's not perfect. It's maybe a different, more human side of a conversation.
That is on point. This is my last question because I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. I know some of you are taking a lunch break to do this. So last question is, when you are thinking about branding, do you even consider how long your podcast is in that strategy? Is that a part of your strategy? If you say, 30 minutes of fun or
yeah. That's what I did. I think if you can think about the time, again, sometimes it takes you a little bit of practice to figure out what feels too long or what feels too short. I geared mine for about 30 minutes because I thought for a conversation, 30 minutes will feel like we can cover a lot of terrain, but it's not going to feel like we've run out of stuff to talk about. And so I figured I could kind of keep it, 25 to 40 minutes, but roughly I'm aiming for 30. Just as a way to feel like it's a dynamic conversation. If someone's really trying to educate and break down a really complex topic into a short amount of time, that can happen. Or they're like, no, I need a full hour. Or in the case of Dax Shepard, he's intentionally having these much longer conversations because celebrities and academics, all these people are used to being condensed down into small sound bites, and they really don't get to communicate the kind of breadth and depth that he wanted to be able to. So there is no perfect formula, but it is like, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you wanting to be in and out, kind of short and pithy, or do you want to go deep? And I think you just have to maybe play with it to figure it out. But I would start with an idea in mind of how long you want it to be.
Awesome. Well, that is the end for now, guys, but not the end of this festival. So first and foremost, thank you, Lisa, for coming and joining us and giving us some wisdom today. I know I appreciate it. Looks like in the chat, there are lots of people who are also appreciative. Everyone, please remember this is recorded. So you will get this recording. If you missed something, someone mentioned they were having issues with sound, you'll get this back. So by the end of the month, when we wrap up, we'll be sending these out. So this is not your last chance to hear what you heard today. You have her information. You know where to find her. Please do. You also know that she will be having a session tomorrow that goes into this a little deeper with Perrin. So if you have not registered for that yet, get into it. You're going to want to. I can tell by your questions today that you want some of that information. So do not miss out. Okay. If you also just want to talk to more people and hang out, remember on Fridays, we have happy hour. So this is not the end of us. If you have not gotten enough of us yet, we can hang out, chill, have some wine, me from here, you from wherever you are, and toast on Friday night, and then talk to the presenters for the week. So do know that that is also an option. If you're sharing anything about this festival, please, 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 take a look at our hashtag CLT Podcast Fest. Tag that, share it, let us know your thoughts. If you got some pictures, if you've got the cool t-shirt, hold on, my camera. I'm gonna show off my t-shirt for a minute. You'll want it. It's extremely soft. And I don't say that about a lot of t-shirts. I am not a t-shirt girl, but this t-shirt is still available. So please go grab you one because it's real comfy and it's cute colors. I love this teal. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Check out more sessions. Join us later. We hope to see you again, and I hope you took some info from us. Thank you again, Lisa. Have a good rest.